I'm Brian Gibbons, and here we are at the third video in our series of videos about how to prepare a good science presentation. Now this video is particularly important for science presentation because it's all about how to organize scientific presentations and some specific things that make science presentations a little bit different than other types of presentations that you've been working with. Although I'm sure that the scientific presentation has several definitions, here when I was saying scientific presentation, what I mean is a presentation where you'll primarily be presenting an experiment or an idea or something that you have perhaps done in the lab, as well as any results and implications that those may have. Here you can see we have a couple of examples of some orators there giving a scientific presentation. You can see there's the one on the left who's kind of, looks like he's walking out from behind his podium and he's got some hand gestures and he looks like he's engaging his audience. We have the one on the right, which is perhaps more of an sort of a old school lecturing style where someone will hide out behind the podium, kind of got their notes in front of them and they'll look right down at them the whole time. Hopefully, if you've been watching this series of videos so far, you can identify which of those two is probably the better way to go. And just so you know, it is the one on the left there. It's a little bit more demonstrating exactly what we would like to see in a science presentation. So how does one actually go about creating a good scientific presentation? Let's go find out. So first, what you're probably used to is you're used to looking at scientific reports and scientific journals that have a lot of very specific things that are required in a specific order. So a typical scientific paper will have the introduction, methods, results, and discussion. Now what I really like about this slide is it shows you that while the order of those things is the same, and while all those things are essentially also mentioned in a scientific talk, the amount of time you spent on any of them is a little bit different in a scientific talk or a scientific presentation. The most notable difference is when you're doing a scientific presentation, you have to give a lot more background information just to make sure everyone in the audience is on the same page. This is especially true when you're presenting to people who aren't your colleagues, who don't necessarily know what it is you work on a day-to-day basis. You want to have plenty of background so that it's very clear why you're doing the research that you're doing. Another key difference is you'll notice that the methods section is much smaller. This is something that you want to just say very briefly. You'll kind of shrink that section down. People can ask questions if they have questions that are more specific, but when you're speaking, you don't need to elaborate too much on that part. So like all presentations, a good science presentation starts with an introduction. And also akin to all presentations, you want to start with some sort of an attention getter that's going to grab them and hook them into your problem. A lot of times this may be something very simple. For example, if you're working with a disease, you might say this disease infects millions of people around the world. Or this disease is one of the least studied diseases that we know about. We'd like to know more. Something like that was a really good way to open up. You also want to give the big picture and show how your specific kind of narrow experiments fit into this whole broader field rich with information. Typically in the beginning you will outline your talk, say, kind of this is generally what we're going to do. You'll even it's often good to have an outline slide at the beginning that will explain what you're going to talk about. This is a good way of preventing people from looking at their watch the entire time going, man, come on, how many more slides are there? They'll know when you're done because you have told them already what your outline is earlier on. Also, and somewhat counterintuitively, it's often a very good idea to start out saying some of your results and say, really, we were doing some interesting research and we found this key thing and we're going to talk about how that was found and what some of the implications are. So you can kind of give them a teaser at the beginning and say, this is kind of where we're going. Now I'm going to back up a little bit and tell you how we got there. Next, the methods and results section. This is an area that is very easy to become, it can very easily become too complicated. So generally, I would advise keeping it very simple. Don't be overly technical. Don't use elaborate terms and jargon where they're not necessary. And really just present the main and key points. You don't want to focus on big equations, on anything that is kind of outside the realm of your key results. Just really say, these are the core things that we did, the core things you need to know. If they don't need to know, you don't have to tell them. A typical way of displaying this is sort of the standard question, experiment, results format. So typically you'll have some question, some idea, some underlying focus that kind of drew you into doing a particular experiment. You'll say that, say what the experiment is and what you did, say what the results were, and oftentimes those results will lead you down to the next question, and what eventually becomes kind of a string of questions. So this is a very common way that one might organize their scientific presentation. Certainly not the only way, but it's a highly recommended way that I suggest. So if you were at a presentation and you saw this gentleman here giving this particular slide, you might start to freak out a little bit, like how much of this stuff do we actually have to memorize? There's quite a bit there. There's letters, there's numbers, there's all kinds of charts and graphs. It's probably a little bit too busy. So as the title slide here suggests, simple data slides typically are the ones that are going to work the best. So what do I mean by a simple data slide? I mean, if it has graphics, you should keep those graphics fairly simple and straightforward. If you're borrowing them from elsewhere, you should first of all reference them, but also you can delete parts that are unnecessary for the audience understanding your figure. You can simplify, you can annotate and draw little arrows, draw little words to make things more clear. Don't incorporate complex tables. I've seen a lot of people will put an entire PowerPoint slide, it'll be one solid giant table. People never like to look at those slides. That's just a simple truth. It's much better to simplify that or display that information in a different way. And last but not least, you can use a schematic diagram to illustrate the experiment or the process or whatever it is you're talking about. And that'll go a long ways towards simplifying your methods and your results, making it really clear exactly what you did. This, for example, is one particular figure. You can see it's on the surface of it, it's not bad. This is an example of a schematic diagram. But what we're also seeing here is there are a lot of extra text. There's a lot of text in the lower left and in the upper left. There's lots of names. Typically, your audience is either going to be reading your slide or listening to you, and they're not going to be doing both. And if there's a lot of text on this, chances are a lot of it's going to be ignored, or it will just be skipped because the person couldn't read it fast enough. So instead of this slide, I'd recommend something more like this. Notice all that unnecessary text was taken away, and the titles and the key words were enlarged and put right where they needed to be to make a much simpler figure. You can also notice it says modified from down there at the bottom and has the reference for where that particular figure came from. This is important if you didn't actually create this figure yourself. Here's another typical data slide that you might see in any presentation. Again, it's not bad. You can see there's a lot of data there, some countries, we got a graph. It's also not really ideal. You can see, for one thing, it's hard to tell what is important about this graph. And for another, it's actually not even on the center of the page. It's kind of askew off to one side. So if I were to suggest a way to redo this, I would recommend something along the lines of this. This is the after image here where it says Danes cycle 16 times farther than Americans each day. That's very clear, it's to the point, and you're even highlighting that by specifically color coding those individual bars there in this histogram for the USA and for Denmark. Much nicer, much clearer. It may take a little bit longer to make, but in the end, it's definitely worthwhile. When you come to the very end of your presentation, sometimes people have a tendency to want to provide too much information, to completely go through almost everything over again. That's not what you want to do. You want to have essentially one slide at the very end that is your summary slide, and it should only have a few succinct and clear messages on it. So no more than, say, 4 or 5 messages should be on that slide. Speaking of slides to end a presentation and having only 4 or 5 things on it, this brings us to the end of our third video about scientific presentations. Some of the things we talked about and some of the things that I think are most important to remember are, one, noting that when you give a scientific talk, it's going to require a lot of background information. So that's probably one of the areas you'll end up spending quite a bit of time to find appropriate references and to say enough, but not too much. Second, it's oftentimes very good to use that question, experiment, result format as a method of organizing your results section. It works very well. It's not required, it's not a mandate that says you have to do that, but it works very well. Thirdly, you should simplify your figures and your methods substantially. Don't use elaborate tables or elaborate figures. Simplify wherever possible. And last but not least, conclude using just a single slide, which is exactly what we just did here. So again, that is the end of our third video in this series of videos on scientific presentations. I hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for video 4.